The jungle doesn't care about your training. It doesn't care about the specialized skills it took 3 years to acquire, the languages memorized in dim classrooms at Fort Bragg, or the unconventional warfare techniques that earned a green beret and a set of orders most soldiers never receive. At 0300 on a moonless October morning, 6 kilometers inside Laos, the primary rule of survival has nothing to do with weapons or tactics. It only cares about one thing: that you are here, that you don't belong here, and that everything living in this darkness already knows it. The trail doesn't announce itself. It waits. Tonight, it was already waiting for Recon Team Idaho. Staff Sergeant Thomas Hawk Carver, 26, from Knoxville, Tennessee, felt the rotor wash die the moment the helicopter banked away into the black. 4 months in country, 3 insertions, 1 emergency extraction under fire that still woke him at 2 in the morning. He was the man his team looked to. Not the loudest, not the most decorated, but the calmest, when calm was the hardest thing to be. Beside him, Sergeant Manny Reyes from El Paso pressed his back against a teak trunk, eyes closed, listening. Specialist 4th Class Danny Kowalski, Pittsburgh, 22, his first insertion, adjusted his Car 15 without a sound. Behind them both, Locke, their Montagnard point man, raised one fist. Freeze. Something was wrong. Not tactically wrong. Wrong in a way no training had prepared Carver to name. The jungle had gone completely, utterly silent. No insects, no tree frogs, no movement in the canopy above. In every insertion he had run across 2 years of special operations, he had never heard the jungle go that quiet. He would understand why in 31 hours. If you're watching this, you already understand that the men who ran these missions operated in a world most Americans never knew existed. No official acknowledgement, no public medals, no mention in the evening news. They came home to silence. This channel exists to tell their stories with the accuracy and respect they deserve, without glorifying what they endured or simplifying the impossible choices they faced every time a helicopter dropped them into the dark. Subscribe now and join those who refuse to let these missions disappear into the classified files where Washington tried to bury them.
Thomas Carver did not enlist to see the world. He enlisted because his father had served in Korea and come home changed in ways the family never discussed. Quieter, more careful, watchful, in a way that marked him as someone who had looked at a specific kind of thing and could not look away from it afterward. Carver wanted to understand that change, not to replicate it, to understand it. He was 22 when he shipped to Fort Bragg for Special Forces assessment and selection, a lean kid from Knoxville who had grown up hunting deer in the Smoky Mountains and understood, better than most city boys, how a forest could hide things in plain sight. He carried one photograph in his chest pocket: his mother, his father, and his younger sister standing in front of their white clapboard house on the day he graduated high school. His father had his hand on Thomas's shoulder. It was the only photograph his father had ever agreed to pose for. Carver had studied it in more dark hours than he could count, looking at his father's eyes, flat, careful, absent in some specific way, and wondering whether they had always looked that way or whether Korea had done it. Wondering whether his own eyes were beginning to look the same. He had watched his first team member die 14 months earlier. Sergeant First Class Eddie Pruitt from Birmingham, 10 years in, the kind of soldier who seemed genuinely bulletproof, had taken a round through the neck on a trail in Quang Tri Province during Carver's second month in country. Pruitt was dead before the medevac was 3 minutes out. Carver had held pressure on the wound with both hands and watched it not be enough. He had filed the after-action report. He had written the letter to Pruitt's wife. And he had gone back on the next insertion 6 days later because that was what you did, and because the alternative was to become someone he no longer recognized in the mirror. His team was good. Reyes had 14 months in country, the kind of soldier who never complained and never panicked, who could navigate by starlight and stay quiet for 12 hours straight without losing focus. Kowalski was newer but steady in a way Carver recognized, the steadiness of someone who hadn't yet been broken and still believed in some fundamental way that the training would cover everything. Carver knew it wouldn't. He knew from experience that there were things the trail revealed that no training anticipated. He made a silent, private promise the night before each insertion. Bring them back. Every single one. By October of 1969, MACV-SOG had been running cross-border reconnaissance into Laos for 5 years. The trail was not one road. It was a living system. Thousands of kilometers of routes threading through mountain passes and river valleys, maintained by the 559th Transportation Group, guarded by more than 100 NVA battalions that knew every ridge line and every creek crossing. Teams like Idaho went in with 72-hour mission windows, intelligence objectives that justified the insertion, and the statistical reality that approximately 1 in 3 insertions ended in emergency extraction under fire. The men who ran these missions understood those numbers. They ran them anyway. Carver had been briefed on the specific target for this insertion at Command and Control Central in Ban Me Thuot 48 hours earlier. A suspected NVA truck park and forward supply cache in a valley 6 kilometers from the Laotian border, assessed as a staging area for a logistics push into Quang Nam province. The intelligence was good, intercepts supported by aerial imagery. If the cache was confirmed and its coordinates verified, the bombing coordinates would follow within 24 hours of exfil. The mission had a clear military purpose. That didn't make the jungle any quieter. He would carry that photograph across everything that was about to happen. He would reach for it in the dark and find it. What he could not know, kneeling in the silence of an October night, with his team's breathing the only sound in the world, was that by the time he reached for it next, what it meant to him would be permanently and irrevocably different. Stories like Hawk Carver's don't survive in official records. They survive because people choose to remember them. If you served or knew someone who ran missions in places the government officially denied, the comment section below isn't just a place to type. It's where these experiences live on. Share what you know. Add what history left out. Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Thon of the 559th Transportation Group had been stationed on the trail for 11 months. He was 29 years old, from a village in Thanh Hoa province, and he had not seen his wife or his 2 daughters since January. He did not think of himself as a man at war with the United States. He thought of himself as an engineer, specifically as the man responsible for ensuring that a 17-kilometer stretch of road between 2 waypoints in the Laotian corridor remained passable through the monsoon season and the bomb craters and the constant pressure of American air power. He had rebuilt one section of road 11 times in 4 months. He was proud of this. The Americans had more aircraft, more bombs, and more money than he could imagine. He had something they did not. He was never going to stop. Thon commanded a road watch unit of 40 soldiers and a civilian work detail of roughly 60 laborers, many of them local Lao and Vietnamese men recruited, or conscripted, into the trail's maintenance network. His soldiers were disciplined, experienced in counter-reconnaissance, and deeply familiar with the terrain that American teams kept trying to penetrate. They had caught 2 SOG teams in the previous 8 months. One had been extracted under fire with casualties. The second had not been extracted at all. Thon did not celebrate these outcomes. He filed his reports, attended his political study sessions, and thought about his daughters. He was doing what his country had asked of him, in a place he had not chosen, for reasons that seemed both entirely clear and, on certain nights, impossibly abstract. What Thon understood better than any American planner was that the trail could not be destroyed. It could be disrupted, it could be made more costly, it could be forced to adapt, reroute, and rebuild, but it could not be killed because it was not a fixed thing. It was a relationship between 10,000 determined people and a mountain range that they had been learning to navigate in one form or another for centuries before the first American aircraft arrived. He had watched bombs destroy road sections that his teams repaired before the craters stopped smoking. He had watched his men work in darkness, in rain, in temperatures that climbed past 40 degrees Celsius, moving supplies that would eventually reach the South and matter. He believed this. He held onto it with both hands. For Carver's team, the stakes operated on several simultaneous levels. Personally, survival, and the promise to bring every man back to the extraction point. Tactically, confirm or deny the cache location, establish enemy strength in the immediate area, and extract with the intelligence intact. Operationally, the targeting data, if confirmed, would feed into arc light strikes that could disrupt trail logistics in Quang Nam Province for weeks. Strategically, every successful SOG insertion was also a message that the corridor was not invulnerable, that American eyes were in places the NVA thought were safe, that the cost of operating the trail included a tax of uncertainty that never entirely went away. But the larger strategic calculus had already been made in Washington and in Hanoi, long before Team Idaho touched down in Laos. The trail had been subjected to interdiction campaigns for 5 years. Operation Rolling Thunder, Operation Steel Tiger, Operation Commando Hunt, and the trucks kept moving. The logistics kept flowing. The NVA kept fighting. The trail was not a vulnerability in Hanoi's strategy. It was the strategy. And no 6-man team, however skilled, however brave, was going to change that fundamental equation. Carver didn't know this yet in the way that history would eventually make clear. He only knew the 72-hour window, the grid coordinates on his map, and the silence that was pressing in from all directions. If the teams were compromised, if Thon's watchers reported their position before exfil was possible, there would be no diplomatic incident. There would be no official acknowledgement. There would only be a notification letter and a set of personal effects shipped home in a box too light for what it was supposed to contain. If you're still watching, you already understand something most people don't. That military history isn't about glorifying war. It's about honoring the people who fought them. Subscribe now and join the community that refuses to let these stories become footnotes. And hit that like button. It tells YouTube these stories matter. The first thing Carver felt was the ground. Not under his boots. He had been kneeling for 4 hours in a shallow depression 40 meters off a secondary trail, listening to the sounds of the jungle reconstruct itself around Team Idaho's position. He felt it through his palms, pressed flat against the damp soil, the faint tremor of something moving at significant weight somewhere to the northwest. Not an animal. The rhythm was wrong for an animal. Too regular, too patient. Whatever was moving through the jungle toward them was doing so with the careful, deliberate pace of men who had been moving through this terrain in darkness for a very long time and were no longer afraid of it. Then the sounds began to separate. What had been silence became layers. Carver heard it first as a low, almost mechanical clicking, the sound of equipment being managed with practiced hands, the soft collision of web gear, the suppressed percussion of boots finding dry ground with intent. Then, further back, another layer, voices, low and close-grouped, the cadence of a column moving with casual confidence through terrain it owned completely. He pressed his thumb against Reyes's forearm once. Reyes went still. Kowalski, to Carver's left, had already stopped breathing in any way that made sound. Then Carver saw them. The moon had shifted enough to let a thin band of light reach the trail through a gap in the canopy, and in that light he counted silhouettes. Not a patrol, a column. AK-47s slung, packs riding high, moving with the unhurried efficiency of men who had been doing this for months and expected to keep doing it for months more. He counted to 15 before the column's head disappeared around a bend. He did not stop counting. He reached 30 before the tail of the column came into view. He reached 47 before the last man passed within 22 meters of where he lay absolutely motionless in the dark. The smell reached him as the column passed. Diesel fuel and sweat and something else, something sharper, that he identified after a moment as gun oil, fresh and recently applied. These men had cleaned their weapons recently. They were prepared for contact. The smell filled the depression and sat there even after the last figure disappeared into the tree line, and Carver breathed it in through his nose in slow, controlled increments, letting his heart rate come down, letting his hands unclench. The taste of copper was in the back of his throat. He had not bitten himself. It was something else, adrenaline metabolizing, the body's chemistry responding to the proximity of the kind of danger that the brain processes before the conscious mind catches up. He worked saliva and swallowed it, forcing himself back to function. 50 meters to the east, a young NVA soldier named Duke, 17 years old from a province Carver had never heard of, was walking rear security for the column and feeling something he could not entirely name. He had been on the trail for 3 months, long enough to understand how it felt when something was wrong in a sector, long enough to know the difference between jungle silence that meant nothing and jungle silence that meant something was in it with you. He did not stop walking. He adjusted his weapon. He listened harder. He would report the feeling to his section leader when they reached the next waypoint in 40 minutes. The column was not the target. The column was something else, a combat element moving into a flanking position, coordinating with something that Carver's team had not yet identified and did not have the intelligence to anticipate. In Da Nang, in the targeting cells, no one knew about this movement. The aerial imagery was 12 days old. The trail adapted faster than imagery cycles. Locke moved to Carver's position without sound, placed his mouth 2 centimeters from Carver's ear, and held up 3 fingers. 3 seconds. Then he pointed northeast. Northeast of their position, something very large and very organized was waking up. Carver began to understand in the precise and physical way that only proximity to serious danger allows, what he had not understood in the briefing room. The truck park wasn't a static cache. It was a node in a system that was, at this moment, actively moving. And Team Idaho was inside the perimeter of that movement without knowing it. The payoff of the silence that had greeted them on insertion arrived with the clarity of a door being opened. The jungle had been silent because the jungle was full. Every creature that lived in this sector had already registered the presence of hundreds of men and had gone still. Team Idaho had landed in the middle of a battalion's operational area and mistaken the silence for emptiness. Now the emptiness had texture, and the texture was terrifying. But that was only the beginning. They lay in the depression for 90 minutes after the column passed. 90 minutes of absolute stillness, absolute silence, the slow management of fear that special operations training reduces to a series of physical protocols, breathing rates, muscle management, sensory focus, that give the mind something to do while the body waits. When Locke finally signaled clear, Carver felt the release move through his team like a current. Reyes let out a long, controlled breath and looked at the sky. Kowalski's jaw unclenched. Locke simply rose to a low crouch and began reassessing their position with the calm, systematic attention of a man who had grown up in these mountains and never entirely left them. In the brief, hushed consultation that followed, there was even something close to dark humor. Reyes counted on his fingers. 47 combatants, at minimum, within a quarter kilometer of their hide. Carver replied that the good news was the column had passed without stopping. Reyes said that was not good news, that was deferred bad news, and that there was a meaningful difference. Kowalski retrieved the photograph from his own pocket, his girlfriend Jackie from Pittsburgh sitting on the hood of his car, and studied it for exactly 3 seconds in the way Carver recognized as a private ritual, a point of contact with a world that still existed somewhere outside this jungle. Then he tucked it away and was ready. Carver reached into his chest pocket and touched the edge of his own photograph without taking it out. His father's hand on his shoulder, his father's flat, careful eyes. He had made a promise. He was going to keep it. 50 meters away, in a shallow bunker dug into a hillside and covered with cut vegetation, a 23-year-old NVA sergeant named Hoa was writing a letter to his mother in the minutes between watch rotations. The letter contained the same reassurances he always wrote. The food was adequate, his health was good, he was fulfilling his duty with honor. The letter would take 6 weeks to arrive if it arrived at all. He sealed it, put it in his shirt pocket, and rose to take his position. Then Locke's hand was on Carver's wrist. Firm, not the single finger that meant attention. The whole hand, which meant now. What Locke had identified, in the 45 seconds since the all clear, was this: their exfiltration route, the ridgeline they had planned to follow back to the primary extraction zone, was no longer clear. A second element had moved into the saddle between their position and the ridge during the 90 minutes of stillness. The route was blocked. The alternate route took them directly through 500 meters of the truck park's active perimeter. The emergency extraction frequency was available, but calling it would bring helicopters into a hot zone, into darkness, into terrain where a battalion-strength element was operating with anti-aircraft weapons that the 12-day-old imagery had not detected. Every option had a cost that was too high. What do you do? Not in theory. Not with a training cadre watching from a safe distance and a scenario that ends when the instructor calls time. Right now, your team is looking at you. You have 4 people whose lives are your specific responsibility. You have an intelligence package that could save American lives if you get it out. You have a radio that you can use once before every element in this sector knows exactly where you are. You have a man in his first insertion who is steady but has never been in a contact this close. And you have approximately 8 minutes before the next watch rotation changes the terrain around you again. What do you do? Carver made the call. Not the emergency extraction, not yet. Not the alternate route through the perimeter. He chose the third option, the one that had not been briefed because no one had anticipated this exact configuration of problems. A controlled movement to a secondary hide, tighter and deeper into the terrain, to wait for first light and a reassessment of all three routes simultaneously. It was not the bold choice. It was not the choice that ended the mission fast. It was the choice that kept his team alive through the next 4 hours while the battalion element completed whatever it was doing and created, potentially, a gap. The cost was time. Time meant more exposure. More exposure meant the probability of detection increased with every hour. And Kowalski, who was steady, who had held everything together in the 90 minutes of absolute stillness, was beginning to show in his breathing and in his eyes the first signs of the kind of strain that first insertions eventually produce when the gap between training and reality becomes impossible to ignore. The promise Carver had made the night before, bring them all back, sat in his chest like a stone, because for the first time since the mission began, he could not see a clear path to keeping it. The choice was made. The consequences were just beginning. Dawn on the trail comes in stages. First, a graying of the black that has nothing to do with visibility. The darkness simply becomes less absolute, less total, a softening rather than a lifting. Then the birds, cautious and intermittent at first, then in volume. Then the light itself, filtering through the triple canopy in isolated beams that illuminate nothing useful, but remind you that the sun still exists and that the world above this jungle is operating on ordinary physics. For Carver, lying in the secondary hide with his team through 4 additional hours of operational stillness, dawn meant one thing. The watch rotations had shifted twice. The column element had moved south toward the truck park's main body, and the ridgeline was open. He confirmed it with Locke through a series of hand signals that took 45 seconds. Locke moved to the edge of the hide, was gone for 6 minutes, and returned with the kind of expression that said the route was passable and they needed to move immediately. Carver made the decision in under 10 seconds. They would move for the ridge. They would sacrifice the secondary objective, the truck park's precise coordinates, in favor of extracting the primary intelligence, the battalion-strength element, its composition, its direction of movement, and its apparent operational timeline. That intelligence, in the hands of the right analyst in Da Nang, was worth more than any bomb crater in a valley. 60 meters away, Duke, the 17-year-old rear security soldier who had felt something wrong the night before, was completing his own version of a decision. He had reported his instinct to his section leader at the waypoint. His section leader had ordered a sweep of the area at first light. The sweep team was 4 men, moving on a search pattern that would, in approximately 22 minutes, cross the exact path Team Idaho needed to traverse to reach the ridge. Carver did not know about the sweep. Locke did not know about the sweep. The only person in this sector who had any sense of what was converging was Duke, who was following orders, doing his job, and moving through terrain he had been assigned to clear. He was not a villain. He was a young soldier executing a tactically sound response to a threat report. On the other side of the same jungle, the same morning, Carver was executing a tactically sound exfiltration based on the best available information. Both of them were competent. Both of them were doing exactly what their training and their mission required. The jungle didn't care about any of that. The contact happened at 0617. Locke saw the sweep team's point man at a distance of 30 meters and went to ground. The signal passed down the team in under 2 seconds. Carver was already moving, not away, because away was back into the occupied sector, but parallel to the ridge, into a terrain feature that the topographic map showed as a stream bed, and that turned out, in reality, to be a ravine with 3 meters of vertical drop on both sides. The team went into it in sequence. Kowalski went last. He was 4 steps from the edge when the sweep team's point man made visual contact and the morning came apart. The firefight lasted 7 minutes. In the way of all close-quarters contacts in dense terrain, it was not a controlled tactical engagement. It was a violent compression of time and space in which decisions were made in fractions of seconds, and the difference between outcomes was often a matter of inches. Reyes engaged the point man and the trailing second soldier simultaneously, buying the team 12 seconds. Carver called the emergency extraction frequency, 1 transmission, grid, authentication, break, and then put the radio down and picked up his Car 15. It wasn't about firepower. It was never about firepower when you were 4 Americans and 1 Montagnard against a sweep team that was already calling for the reaction force. It was about refusing to quit when quitting was the only logical choice. Duke, pinned in the stream bed with his 2 surviving teammates, was doing the same calculation from the other direction. He was a 17-year-old soldier in a firefight he had initiated with people he'd been told were enemies, but who, in the specific and horrible immediacy of those 7 minutes, were simply other men trying not to die in the same ravine. He held his position. He called for his reaction force. He did what his training required. He was terrified and he was competent, and both of those things were true at the same time. The extraction helicopter arrived at 0704, 47 minutes from transmission to skids on the ground, a response time that Carver later would describe as miraculous, and that the helicopter crews would describe as standard operating procedure, because for them it was. The door gunners worked the tree line. Carver pushed Kowalski aboard first, then Reyes, then 2 of the Montagnard fighters. Locke was the last man on. The helicopter pulled pitch and climbed into a sky that had turned from gray to pale gold, and that from altitude looked completely indifferent to everything that had just happened below it. What had been at stake? The battalion intelligence, the extraction of the full team, the confirmation that the trail's defensive posture was more developed than American planners had estimated, was resolved not by the plan, but by a 17-year-old NVA soldier whose instinct had been right, and by a 26-year-old American sergeant who had made the correct decision at every branch point, under conditions that made correct decisions nearly impossible to identify. Both of them were right. Both of them did their jobs. History would record only one of those truths. Victory came, but the cost was still being counted. The numbers from Operation Prairie Fire's 1969 to 1970 operational period were not the kind of numbers that appeared in press briefings. MACV-SOG's casualty rates during this period ran 2 to 3 times higher than those of conventional infantry units operating in South Vietnam. Of the recon teams that inserted into the Laotian corridor during this fiscal year, roughly a third experienced emergency extractions under fire. A smaller number did not make it to extraction at all. Teams that went off comms and stayed off comms, whose last known positions were plotted on maps in Da Nang and never updated because there was nothing to update them with. Each of those grid coordinates on a map represented men, represented families who received visits from uniformed officers with specific, carefully prepared language and a set of personal effects that was never quite complete. From Team Idaho's firefight at 0617 on that October morning, 1 Montagnard fighter, a man who had gone by the call sign kept for the duration of his service with SOG, whose actual name Carver would not learn for 11 years, was killed in the ravine during the initial contact. He was 28 years old. He had 3 children. His family received no official notification, no benefits, no acknowledgement that he had existed in any military capacity, because the nature of SOG's Indigenous Personnel Program meant that its Montagnard fighters existed, from the American government's perspective in a deliberate administrative absence. Carver would carry this specific fact for the rest of his life in a way that was distinct from the other costs of that morning. Distinct because it was a bureaucratic cruelty added to a combat death, which was a category of wrong that had no name he could find. On the NVA side, the sweep team had taken 1 killed and 1 wounded. Duke survived. He filed his report, was commended for his initiative, and was back on duty rotation within 48 hours. The wounded soldier, a 21-year-old from Unggean province named Min, was evacuated to a field station and would spend 4 months in recovery. His family did not know he was wounded. The communications network that connected NVA soldiers to their families was, if anything, less reliable than the American military's notification system. Both sides were sending young men into mountains that did not care about either country's objectives, and both sides were absorbing the losses in silence. The helicopter set down at the forward operating base in Kontum at 08:15. The crew chief helped Kowalski to the tarmac. Kowalski's hands were shaking. He was not injured. His hands were shaking because his body was completing a chemical process that had been running for 7 hours and was only now being permitted to finish. He sat down on the tarmac with his back against the helicopter skid and put his face in his hands for approximately 90 seconds. No one said anything to him about this. Everyone who saw it understood exactly what it was. Carver debriefed for 3 hours. He gave the intelligence on the battalion-strength element, its composition as best he could estimate it, its direction of movement, its apparent staging behavior. The analyst in the debrief room wrote it down and said it was useful. It was useful. It fed into targeting assessments that were acted on within 72 hours. The arc light strike that followed destroyed confirmed truck assets and supply materials in the valley sector. The trail was repaired and operational again in under 48 hours. This was not surprising to anyone in the room. After the debrief, Carver went to the latrine, washed his hands and face, and stood at the sink for a long time. He took the photograph out of his chest pocket and looked at it. His father's hand on his shoulder, his father's eyes. He understood now with the specific and irreversible clarity that experience provides exactly what those eyes looked like and exactly why. The photograph was unchanged. He was not. The object he had carried was still the same. What it meant had been permanently rearranged. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to years, and the weight never got lighter. Thomas Carver left active service in 1972. He went back to Knoxville and worked construction for 6 years because construction was physical and loud and required a kind of attention that didn't leave room for other things. He married in 1975. He had 2 sons. He did not talk about the trail. He did not talk about Kep, whose family had received nothing. He did not talk about Duke, the 17-year-old NVA soldier whose instinct had been right, and who had been doing nothing more or less than what Carver himself had been doing on the other side of the same ravine. The nightmares were not spectacular in the way that movies suggested nightmares should be. They were specific. The silence before the insertion. The moment of understanding what the silence meant. The 7 minutes in the ravine. The photograph, unchanged in his pocket while everything around it changed. He learned to sleep with the television on. His wife understood this without it being explained, because she had learned over years of proximity to understand what did and did not require explanation. He found the Vietnam Veterans of America chapter in Knoxville in 1984 and went to 2 meetings before he stopped going because the meetings made things louder rather than quieter. He went back in 1989 and stayed. Something had changed in him by then. Not a healing exactly, but an accommodation. The weight had not gotten lighter. He had gotten stronger in a way that was specific to carrying certain kinds of weight for a long time. He never found Kep's family. He tried through channels that no longer formally existed, with the help of a researcher who specialized in MACV-SOG's indigenous personnel records. He found a name and a province. He found no living family members with whom contact could be established. He accepted this the way you accept things that cannot be changed. Not easily, not completely, but permanently. He served honorably. His team served honorably. The NVA soldiers who guarded the trail, Than, who rebuilt roads 11 times in 4 months. Duke, who trusted his instinct and acted on it. Min, who spent 4 months in a field hospital and never made the evening news. They served honorably too. They did what their country asked of them, with skill and courage and commitment, in a place none of them chose, for a cause that each of them believed in with everything they had. The fault, when there was fault, lay in the strategy that sent men into a campaign with no achievable terminal condition, in the political decisions that kept the trail alive by making its interdiction militarily impossible while pretending otherwise, in the willingness to spend human beings on objectives that the evidence, available even then, suggested could not be achieved. The soldiers did their part. The question, the one that history has answered with the kind of finality that is impossible to argue with, is whether the leaders did theirs. War creates heroes on all sides. It also creates Kep, whose family received nothing. It creates Min, who was wounded in a fight no one recorded. It creates young men on both sides of a ravine who are doing exactly what they were trained to do and who will carry the morning for the rest of their lives. The courage of one doesn't diminish the courage of the other. Both things can be true. Both should be remembered. Carver still has the photograph, his father's hand on his shoulder, his father's eyes. He showed it to his sons when they were old enough to understand what they were looking at. He told them about Korea, what he understood of it, which was more now than it had been, and still less than everything. He told them that the eyes in photographs don't change, but the people looking at them do. He told them that the trail doesn't lose. It only decides when to collect. He meant it as a warning. He also meant it as something else, a recognition that the men who went into those mountains and came out again, from both sides, were shaped by something that demanded to be taken seriously. That their courage and their losses deserved more than footnotes. If you served or knew someone who served in the shadows of a war that officially didn't happen, their sacrifice was real. Their courage was real. Subscribe and join those who refuse to forget. Share this story if you believe these experiences matter. And remember, honor the warriors, question the wars.